Thank you. Mr. Pascrell.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Werfel, it appears after the time that you've been here this morning that we are not past the point where members of Congress would be speculating about enemies lists, cultures of corruption, and Nixonian conspiracy theories. I mean, if you took the last set of questions to you, first of all, I wonder why in God's name you took this job in the first place at this point in your life. You have a distinguished past, very distinguished past. But if I took the last series of questions, if you want to talk about a conspiracy theory, the person is not even in front of us to ask direct questions to that young lady. Now everything is open. Ask questions about anything. I understand that, but in both sides of the aisle seem to be against, appear to be against singling out any particular groups because of their political thinking. This is what we are opposed to.
Yes.
This is what we're opposed to. So I commend you for standing up, standing tall, and I wish you success in your job. I think you're trying your best. In your report, you announced that in order to deal with the backlog of applications for 501c4 status, the IRS would allow the option for groups to get preliminary approval if they self-certify that they devote more than 60% of their spending and time on things related to social welfare, to go with no more than 40% on political activities. Is there any reason that this is not the existing standard for all 501c4 organizations?
It potentially could be. What we thought would be appropriate was we have a situation with an overdue backlog. We have a situation in which we clearly have had struggles to effectively implement the current regulation of primary. We came up with this self-attestation program because we thought that it would be less burdensome on the taxpayer and still effective in meeting the underlying regulation of primary. But we haven't broadly applied it across all 501c4.
Well, how did you arrive at the 40% in the first place?
Here's what we tried to, keep in mind that the IRS's role here is to implement the laws and regulations as clearly and as effectively as possible. We have this word primary. And so we sat down with it and we said, what is the most plain language understanding of primary that we can defend? And we came up with the conclusion that if you're north of 50%...
Who came up with that?
The IRS. We sat down and we talked through it, and we briefed committees and others on this before we issued it in final. That if your activities are greater than 50%, you're clearly not primary. Okay, if your political intervention is greater than 50%. If you're less than 40%, we would think that you're in a comfortable safe zone of not being in that primary range. Between 40 and 50%, it gets tougher. And therefore, if you're a taxpayer and you believe that your expenditures are somewhere between 40 and 50%, you wouldn't attest. You'd go through the traditional review, and we'd take a close look to make sure.
And that's why people apply to you in order to obtain this status.
Yes.
And you determine from what they give you, the information they give you, as to whether or not they're more than 40% involved in whatever political culture there exists.
Essentially, we're trying to figure out what this primary means, and what we're offering with the self-attestation is some inherent structure to how we can think about it.
Now, once that organization receives approval, will they be able to increase their political activities beyond the 40%?
If they,
spending and time. That's part of the application.
If they do that, then they are no longer operating under an approval, and they have to alert the IRS that they've changed the nature and extent of their activities.
But they're allowed to continue?
They're allowed to continue, and the reason why they're allowed to continue is because one of the key points here is that you can operate as a 501c4 today without an application. There's two different types of entities that are operating as a 501c4. Those who have an application approved and those that never applied but just file the appropriate forms and operate as a 501c4. If you exceed your 40% after a testing, you just move yourself into that second category where you're operating without an approved application, and you're joining many other 501c4 taxpayers that are doing that today.
So the exemption is very important in terms of revenue. The exemption is more important to decide whether it's more than 40% or less than 40%. And if you go over 40%, you simply have to file a form with the IRS
to let us know
determine.
exactly.
So there are, I can assume then in conclusion, other organizations out there that are performing more than 40%. Or maybe more than 50% in the political area and are being exempt from taxes.
I think if
Time's expired, so
okay.
just answer briefly.
I would say if they're performing more than 50%, then my hope would be that we would have an effective exam and audit process that would identify that and to work with the taxpayer to correct it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Buchanan.